Chapter 6 is entitled, "O Brave New World." But the concept that we need to understand throughout this chapter is imperialism, and how the imperialist mindset and imperialist behavior was a result of the expansionist worldview that came about because of the age of exploration. So therefore, throughout this chapter, hopefully we'll be able to understand how exploration and expansion can affect the worldview of a society and the society that it comes in contact with. So first of all, we need to understand that the expansionist worldview was directly resulted in European imperialism. First of all, the word imperialism or the concept means command or empire. The expansionist worldview turned into imperialism. Imperialism is that extension of power over a territory, meaning its resources like gold, silver, oil, even fisheries, and plantations, like even farming, as well as its people. And let's not forget that people are the most important and precious resource that we have to get things done. Portugal, Spain, and other European countries wanted more than ever to expand their world. They wanted all of their power over all of its territories, resources, and the people that they came across. First of all, in this section of the textbook, we're going to examine how Europeans treated the other people that they came in contact with and consider what their actions might say about their worldview. In order to get an understanding of this, we did a class activity based on a set of scenarios, and we looked at identifying what elements of worldview could be identified as a result of their actions and their decisions. Here we talked about how Sir Francis Drake could be seen as a hero as well as a criminal. Sir Francis Drake was taking and stealing gold from the Spanish galleons that were returning from the west. From Spain, he was taking all of their resources that they were risking a lot in order to get. To them, he was seen as a criminal. To the English, whom he was gaining a lot of wealth for, he was seen as a hero, and as a result, was knighted by the Queen. The Treaty of Tordesillas divided the world between Spain and Portugal. However, at the beginning of the Age of Exploration, Portugal and Spain set out expeditions to find trade routes to Asia. After Columbus discovered what he thought was a sea route to Asia, for Spain, Portugal wanted to make sure that it got its fair share of the Asian trade as well. In 1494, the Pope proposed a secret treaty, the Treaty of Tordesillas, that would divide the world between the Spanish and the Portuguese. Now, this is really important. Spain would have all of the land west of this imaginary line that went north and south through the Atlantic Ocean. Make sure that you know that it's between and down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. All right? Portugal would get anything and all the land east of that line. So if you actually look at this here, what this treaty did was it gave Spain all claims to the land of North and South America, except for this little chunk right here, and Antarctica, where Portugal was given control of all of Africa, most of Europe, Asia, India, and then except for this little chunk here of Russia. Now you can imagine that if this treaty had divided the world between two different nations, other countries would not have been very happy about that. Therefore, like I had said, European rulers were very angry when they heard of this treaty. England and France ignored its terms and sent out explorers across the North Atlantic to find new territories. King Henry VII of England gave explorer Giovanni the Cabot the authority to subdue, occupy, and possess all towns, cities, castles, and isles of them found, giving unto us King Henry the rule, title, and jurisdiction of all of these towns, villages, castles, and firm land so found. Therefore, you're saying that you can go and take everything and lay claim to it in the name of England. Now, what's really important to understand with this is how people are starting to turn away from that religious worldview. Because prior to this, especially in the Middle Ages, if the Pope established a treaty like that, all of these other European nations would have respected that. But because of this, and you can see how they're openly defying an order from the church, that they are really starting to turn away from that religious worldview. However, not completely. Here, we actually did the Command and Conquer activity, and remember I showed you a couple of different videos about what kinds of nations that you could actually create. You and a partner were given the responsibility to represent either Spain or Portugal, and you divided up the world amongst yourselves. The heart of this was to understand how hard the art of negotiation, especially when you're talking about nations, would actually be. These are the questions that we discussed, mainly to understand the difficulties that you would have, as well as those effective negotiation tactics, and what you would do differently next time, as well as something that you had learned from this activity. One thing that we really need to understand, and understanding worldview in general, is actually looking at people's actions and their decisions, therefore their behavior, to understand their worldview. The imperialist behavior of Europeans was partly a result of their attitude towards the indigenous people that they found living in these new territories. The territories in Central and South America claimed by Columbus and other Spanish explorers became known as New Spain. Very creative, I know. The Spanish government granted land to people who wanted to settle in New Spain to mine for precious metals and set up plantations to grow crops for export to Spain. Indigenous people were enslaved by Spanish landowners and forced to work in terrible conditions. Millions of people were literally worked to death in the silver mines and fields. This right here, ladies and gentlemen, is a characteristic of imperialist behavior in extending that power and authority over the resources and its people. Here you can see how those precious metals, like gold and silver, as resources, as well as the people as resources, are being used in order to develop wealth for the Spanish monarchy. Here we gave examples and we looked at imperialism from a modern day concept. Here, there are many countries or people that might believe that businesses in Canada and the United States actually practice economic imperialism today and openly use people as resources in order to create the highest possible profits for their businesses. Now, sometimes those business practices that they have are unethical and use child labor or unfair working conditions or unfair wages for their employees. As we did this, we looked at examples from some of our most favorite and the world's most recognizable brands, from Nike to Walmart to Disney, Joe Fresh. Now, looking at imperialist treasure, how was all of this gold and silver being brought back? In the conquest of the Aztec and Incan empires in New Spain resulted in great wealth for Spain. Mines in Peru and Bolivia and other areas shipped thousands of tons of gold and silver, as well as countless emeralds across the ocean to Spain. For a time, Spain was by far the richest country in Europe. However, they weren't the most dominant and influential trading country. That was Portugal. English sailors looked with envy on the Spanish galleons loaded with treasure. Fortunately for them, English shipyards developed small, fast, highly maneuverable vessels. That means that they can move around a lot faster and quicker than these other ones. They were ideal for attacks on the large, slower-moving Spanish galleons. Soon, Spanish captains were raiding Spanish ships in coastal towns in New Spain for treasure. They were being pirates, essentially. These illegal acts were supported by Queen Elizabeth I, who saw them as a way to take a cut of the Spanish profit. Spain's ambassador to England, Bernardo de Mendoza, protested these raids, calling Sir Francis Drake the master thief of the unknown world. Here is the perfect example of how Queen Elizabeth, and she seen him as a hero, and actually was justified in taking those profits from Spain, and how that ambassador and the representation of Spain in England said that he was a master thief, essentially calling him a criminal. Now here we need to consider that terrible cost of imperialism and the horrific impact that it had on these indigenous cultures. In the early 1490s, the Incan and Aztecs had thriving civilizations in what is now Central and South America. Their cities were bigger and more complex, and they had governments that were just as intricate as anything that you had seen in Europe. In only a few years, these empires were destroyed by the Spanish. Everywhere that the Europeans explored and settled in the Americas, the indigenous peoples were the ones that paid a terrible cost. Now, according to Ronald Wright, who was the author of Stolen Continents, the following were some of the results of European imperialism. By the 1600s, less than 1/10 of the original populations of the Americas remained, and perhaps 90 million indigenous people died during that time. Most people died because of diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza, the bubonic plague, yellow fever, cholera, and malaria that was brought by the Europeans. Just like the Europeans didn't have a resistance or immunity to the bubonic plague, these diseases were unknown to the indigenous populations in the Americas, so they had no immunity or resistance to them. Many indigenous people in the Americas completely died out. Among them, the Bothak of Newfoundland and this other group of people, which I don't want to butcher the name, also completely died out. Here you can actually see drawings from Aztec codices that actually show people getting the disease smallpox. Most of the written records, and the reason why it's hard to really accurately describe these cultures right now is because most of the written records of the original peoples of the Americas were destroyed, along with many of their cities and their monuments. The Spanish, for example, burned thousands of ancient books of the Mayan people. Wamampuma was Spanish, and he claimed that his mother was a great-grandchild of the 10th Incas. He learned to read and write Spanish and recorded the history of the Incan people from the time of the coming of the Spanish. He experienced firsthand the Spanish treatment of the indigenous peoples. Lastly, we need to see how did this imperialist mindset and actually going out and extending that influence and dominance, how did it actually impact the lives and the worldview of the European people? Now, when we actually started the Renaissance, understanding the Renaissance beginning in the Middle Ages, we traveled through 350 years of how the knowledge, beliefs, and values of European peoples changed at this time. At the beginning of the Renaissance, European society was slowly moving away from feudalism, merchants, traders, and they were responsible for great economic growth. During the course of the Renaissance, humanists opened the people's eyes to the possibilities of human achievement. Not only did Europeans develop a great appetite for knowledge, they also hungered for the riches and were eager to explore the world around them, therefore impacting their identity. This is important because as they started to become exposed to new ideas and different ways of doing things, it rapidly started to change their identity. While Europeans were learning about the New World, they were also learning about power and wealth. After the Portuguese were setting up colonies all along the shores of the Indian Ocean, Portugal became the most powerful trading country in Europe. Now, I need to be careful because remember, Portugal became the most powerful trading country. However, Spain was the most wealthy nation because of their gold resources. When the Spanish conquered the peoples of the Americas, they took all of their precious metals, and therefore Spain became the wealthiest country in Europe. Other countries in Europe, like France and England, as well as the Netherlands, saw that through imperialism, that is, gaining power in other parts of the world, countries could grow wealthy very quickly. By the late Renaissance, they began to compete for overseas for markets and territories. So markets, that's defined by being able to trade, and territories for new resources like precious metal and even food. The heroes of a society reflect its values and attitudes. In the medieval time, monks and knights were looked at as role models. During the Renaissance, these heroes were replaced by artistic geniuses and daring explorers. Francis Drake captured the imagination of the English because he was the first Englishman to circumnavigate the world. His attacks on Spanish treasure ships brought him wealth to England and earned him the gratitude of Queen Elizabeth I. Elizabeth was a true Renaissance monarch. She was well educated, she read Latin and Greek, and was a great patron of the arts. Under her reign, England defeated Spain, the most powerful country in Europe at the time, in a great naval battle. Remember, at this time, England was developing faster, more effective ships for battle. She sponsored explorers like Francis Drake and settlements in North America. Queen Elizabeth I contributed to England's transformation into a prosperous trading country and a world power. Now, making contact. With the invention of the printing press, illustrated books about Indigenous people were made available, and they were very eager for readers across Europe. These showed the Indigenous people were closer to nature than Europeans. They did not live in closely crowded, noisy, dirty urban areas and cities like the Europeans did. Many of their communities operated on the principles of equality and sharing. These accounts challenged how some people's thinking of European society. Some philosophers began to ask themselves whether it was possible that Indigenous people had happier lives than the Europeans. On the whole, however, Europeans saw themselves as superior beings to those of the Americas. From their perspective, they needed those resources in the Americas to support the European economy and to fuel the establishment of their colonies. Therefore, they seen that they were justified in their behavior and had the authority to go over and control these resources in order to support their economy so they could become more financially stable and financially strong. They saw the competition for land and resources as necessary for their survival and becoming supreme or the strongest nations in the world. This attitude led them to disregard the rights of Indigenous land people and First Nations people to their land and their resources. European expansionism also contributed to the establishment of trade, the slave trade in Africa. It was carried out mainly by English merchants and traders. They bought or captured African men, women, and children, packed them tightly into ships, and took them into the Americas. They were sold to plantation owners who needed those laborers. The Renaissance and the Age of Exploration were the first steps on the road to creating the global village that we live in today. The invention of the printing press allowed knowledge and ideas to be exchanged across all of Europe. Humanism, with its curiosity, optimism, and the belief in the individual, encouraged people to look beyond the world that they knew. The rise of trade business gave people the motivation to venture into the unknown world. By the end of the Renaissance, Europeans had traveled to most of the continents in the world. For the first time in recorded history, the people of these continents had made contact with one another. Wherever the Europeans arrived, they imposed their religion, ideas, values, and economic system, essentially their worldview, on the people that they came across. For better or for worse, the Renaissance had an enormous impact on the way that we live today. As we continue throughout our year in social studies, ladies and gentlemen, we'll start to look at the Aztec worldview paired with this Renaissance worldview of the Spanish that we have just learned about and try to understand. Now, were these two nations so great with worldviews that were so different or so diverse that there was no other opportunity for them to go to war and see which one that you enjoyed